conversation about masculinity are often left out of conversations on gender equity, right? There does seem to be a focus on girls and women, although that seems to be changing, to be fair. But can you talk a little bit about why conversations about masculinity are important, even if we're trying to address disparities for girls and women?
Yeah, absolutely. I think an analogy can be drawn to the issue of race and ethnicity, right? We're looking at racial disparities, or we're looking at better understanding race and its relationship with a whole bunch of other things. We can't just look at um, people of color and um, individuals from a racial minoritized backgrounds. We also need to understand whiteness and sort of the cultural norms, the power and privileges associated with whiteness. And so I think you see the same thing here. That if, we want to really understand gender in its full spectrum, we need to understand how um, masculinities show up in the lives of men and how it affects women. All right. Some people argue that masculinities are directly relevant to women, as masculinities is something that can be performed by both women and men. Um, and so for some women, they might be directly affected by masculine norms too, independent of men. And so all of these make the study of masculinity really relevant. So if you think of masculinity as not simply about men, but about the norms, the stereotypes, their beliefs associated with being men. So you're separating men from masculinities, and that makes it relevant to a whole range of people.
Mhm. And I noticed that so use the term masculinities in the
Yeah,
plural form.
yeah,
Can you say a little bit about that? Because I know a lot of people will tend to just think of masculinity as being one
yeah.
concept.
Yeah, I think among lay people, the term masculinities is not as well known. Um, and I think there's been a shift in the last 10, 20 years towards using the plural form, and a variety of reasons for that. I'll outline a few reasons. Number one, um, if we use the term masculinity, it sort of assumes that there is one unitary construct, right? But really a better way to think about it is masculinities are a collection of different constructs. So to give a very specific example, you can think of masculinities as including both the norms about what it means to be a man. It also includes ideologies, these people's personal beliefs of what it means to be a man. It also includes stereotypes that people impose on others concerning what it means to be a man. Now, all three are obviously related, but they're not identical. All right, so that's a start. Number two, within a particular set of norms, there's a collection of different dimensions. So there might be a norm concerning the need to be self-reliance, and there's a norm concerning uh, the glorification of violence. There's a norm concerning being dominant, and they're all related. But again, there are some differences, and it's possible for people to adhere to one norm but not the other.
Mhm.
And number three, there's a sort of a growing awareness that the term masculinities better reflect kind of the diversity of people around. So when you take into account race and social class and sexual orientation, a variety of different identities from an intersectional perspective, and you say, what you're talking about, I'm not sure this applies to Black men or Latino men or Asian American men. And so that plural form, I think, is just helpful in recognizing the diversity.
Mhm. A lot of our audience is global as well. So I imagine that there can be variability and overlap in how masculinities are conceptualized across societies and cultures.
Absolutely. Yeah, yeah. I think that is the next frontier of research. I mean, um, you look at masculinities across countries, it makes it very helpful to recognize there isn't just one version. The way men, for example, kind of the norms concerning how men should relate to others in one culture can be very different from another culture.
Mhm. Yeah. So in American pop culture, we often hear this term toxic masculinity. Can you define it for us and tell us your thoughts on it?
Um, Not sure how to define it because it's really a pop cultural term, and but at least my understanding of how it's been used, it's a short form for anything bad related to masculinities that typically apply to men. So very often it's used to refer to expressions of masculinities that are like violence and sexist and heterosexist. I think that tends to be kind of the bad stuff, right? Um, there is some ambivalence among scholars about whether to use that term. I want to just put it out there that I don't think there's full consensus. If you do a Google search on Google Scholar, you find some scholars using that term and then others rejecting it. So I don't want to mention, I don't want to kind of prescribe a particular view, but just kind of highlight that this is a contested term. I will mention sort of an influential article by Carol Harrington. It's a 2021 article. You can Google it. But they argue that, that's maybe a term that should not be used, at least because historically the origins of the term has been used to describe historically marginalized men. So, for example, like black men, described as in South Africa described as having expressions of toxic masculinity. So that's in a way could potentially be a way of pathologizing some men. I would encourage you to read the scholarship and come to your own conclusions. But I think at the very least, folks need to know it's a contested term, and there's some disagreement about what it means and whether one should use it.
Mm-hmm. Okay, interesting. Thank you. Um, so with your own work, what are some important learnings that you've taken away,
Yeah,
energy and
yeah,
masculinity?
yeah. I can highlight a few things that I found to be interesting. The first was a meta-analysis that my colleagues and I did of conformity to masculine norms and mental health outcomes. Um, and This just across multiple samples. Overall, we found that the more people conform to masculine norms, the less likely they are to seek mental health services, and also the poorer their mental health. But there are specific dimensions of masculinities where that shows up as kind of a stronger relationship, and so that's why you have to look into the fine prints. And so we found that three specific masculine norms were more problematic. The masculine conforming to the norm of self-reliance, sort of depending on yourself, not wanting to seek help, power over women, which you can see as a form of sexism, and then the masculine norm of playboy, which is sort of sexual promiscuity. And these were the ones that were particularly related to poorer mental health. So I think it's, if you look at the three that I mentioned, two of the three sort of has that a sexist flavor, and so sort of the argument that we try to make was conforming to norms that are misogynistic is not just bad for your relationships with people or morally bad, it could be bad for your mental health too. So
Mm.
that's one thing to think about. The second, which is issue, which I think is interesting, is that I want to be a bit careful of just universally labeling masculinity as, well, again, a singular form as it's just bad for your mental health. Really, a lot depends on how you define and how you measure um, masculinities, right? Researchers would say, how do we operationalize the term, right? What So always, whenever you read a study on masculinities, very often we look at a title and we say relationship between masculinity and mental health. And I don't like that kind of language because it's way too broad. I always want to know what specific construct do you use. And I like to look into the measure and see how you actually measure it. So I want to give a very specific example, again, from my own research. So a couple of years ago, my colleagues and I developed a different measure of masculinities that's from what's been out there. And instead of asking participants to fill out a kind of a scale with items about certain things, whether you do that or not, or whether you agree with this or not, we asked them to fill out a bunch of open-ended prompts. We say, in the US, most people believe that men should or should not, and then you complete the sentence yourself. Say whatever you like, Then we ask them to complete to go back to what they said and say, to what extent do you agree or disagree with these statements? So what I call this measure is that's a measure of subjective masculine norms. So it's your perception of what the norms are out there. You decide yourself what you think the norms are, and then you ask yourself, do you personally endorse these norms? Do you conform to? Do you agree with them? And so we found this measure was ironically, interestingly, actually positively related to happiness and so it's positive mental health. So contrary to how we think about things, right? So that's a little bit different from kind of previous research, but again, it's really how you define, how you measure. Here, we're asking people for their perceptions of whatever norms they like, and then we're saying, if you conform to these norms, then you're higher on subjective masculine norms. So always pay attention to how the norms are measured here. The third thing that I'll just mention is kind of an interesting finding is that apart from trying to figure out the content of masculine norms, I think it's interesting for researchers to also look at the structure of masculine norms. So what I mean by that, let me give a very practical example. In another measure that my colleagues and I developed together with Melissa Berkeley, who was the first author of this study, we developed a measure of what we call masculinity contingencies. And what I mean by that is we don't really care what the content of the masculinities are. Our concern is, do you feel like your self-worth or self-esteem is dependent on how masculine you are? This was a measure for men. And if your answer is yes, there's compelling evidence. That's a problem. It's really a problem. If your self-esteem is dependent on how macho, how masculine, how important you are in terms of masculinities, then it just is correlated with a host of problems like sexism, poor mental health, just poor social relationships. So I think that's something, again, interesting to pay attention to, that, ideally we don't want to have our self-worth based on any particular of how masculine we are. That's just not helpful at all.
Yeah, that's so interesting. And I imagine that if there are life events like a disruption in employment,
Yeah.
or some sort of event where you cannot protect your family in a way that masculinity is often tasked with, that would also be predictive of some of these mental health issues, because you're not able to cope with it as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I just want to go back to your second point, and make sure I understand. So for people who their own beliefs were in line with those subjective norms, that was predictive of a lower level of happiness. Is that right?
Higher.
Higher happiness.
Yeah,
Okay.
which again, it's a little different from how we think about the problematic nature of masculinities. And here's one way to think about it. Sometimes the problems with masculinities is not necessarily that you agree with certain sets of norms, but also your perception that there are some norms of masculinities out there that you don't meet, you don't live up to. So sometimes that's the problem, is the discrepancies. Like, I believe a man should be doing X, Y, and Z, and I don't do these things. and therefore I struggle with my mental health. So
Right. Right.
yeah,
Okay.
that discrepancy is often a problem.
Yeah, interesting. So based on this work that you've been doing,
Mhm.
how do you suggest that we incorporate learnings into decisions about mental health programs or general health programs where we're focusing on men?
Yeah, that's a great question. Um, at the very least, I think in um, any health program that is developed, it doesn't hurt to include one or two, just a few items on gender and masculinities, just to see if, whatever intervention the programs are developing, are you seeing different effects as a function, not just as a function of your gender identity, whether you identify as a woman or man or other genders, but as a function of some measure of masculinities, right? You can
Mm.
just throw in a few items and see, this. If, for example, if you conform to certain beliefs about men, does that make the intervention less or more effective? And if so, that's something to pay attention to. Or do individuals who, for example, stake their self-worth on how masculine they are they more likely to drop out of the program, more likely to or not attend a program? Again, these are things that individual differences that you can pay attention to.
Mhm.
Um, I think also that in whatever programs that you that developed, that it's helpful to find ways to address gender and addressing gender, including masculinities, to see if, for example, um, I mean, there are certain types of activities seen as less desirable because they're viewed as less masculine, and then is there a way to kind of rethink that as something that doesn't threaten your masculinity? So I think these are things that interventionists can sort of pay attention at the back of their minds.
Yeah. Yeah, and it sounds like some transformative thinking around what it means to be a man or to be masculine, and how does that play a role on your mental or physical health.
Yeah, yeah,
At the Gender Equity Unit, we are particularly interested in gender and data.
yeah.
So have you come across any particular gaps in data, or you talked a little bit about measurement issues and studies about masculinities, but any gender gaps that you're seeing regarding masculinities and mental health?
Yeah, one area of research, and again, this is measurement too, that I would love to see more of, and I think this is an area that public health researchers are uniquely poised to take the lead, is in the measurement and study of masculinities at the macro level. So I think right now, over the overwhelming number of studies that conducted, conceptualized masculinities at the individual level. It's just, it's a measure of like a particular individual. But you can definitely study masculinities at a macro level. So you think of it at, for example, in an organization, in an institution, in a neighborhood, in a country level or state level. And there I've written some articles sort of speculating on how you can do that. One very simple method, not the only way to do it, but one very simple method is simply to aggregate data from participants from a particular area. So if you do a kind of kind of international study across multiple countries, you collect data from multiple people, you can have an average score and kind of have a country level masculinities and see if the effects of that on health behaviors and health outcomes differ from what's from an individual's masculinities. And there is actually some emerging research that suggests the answer is yes, there are differences. There's one study, I can't remember the specific findings, but there's one study that, for example, looked at conformity to masculine norms in fraternities. And those, you've got lots of fraternities across multiple campuses. And they looked at both conforming to masculine norms as an individual construct and as a fraternity level construct. So
Mhm.
among the men in the fraternity, U.S. college fraternity, right, they might have an average score, and that average score of masculinities does relate to outcomes that differ from the individual level masculinity. So I think that's interesting.
Yeah. Yeah. And I imagine that even at government levels, so now that more and more countries have gender diversity, particularly women
Yeah,
in leadership positions, I wonder if looking at how much gender, particularly masculine norms, come through in national rhetoric and dialogues, like what
yeah,
impact that has on societies. And I think about this a lot when we see larger structural issues here in the US around, gun policy or, with wars going on and invasion of nations, things like that. How
yeah.
much does masculinity play a role in those, in the way those things are presented and, the dialogue around it? So I
Yeah,
don't know
yeah.
if you see any of that coming through, particularly in your editor duties.
Yeah, I think I would say
That
I would love, I've really been trying to encourage more studies in that area. And would love to see a cross national study of masculinities and looking at indices of masculinities that can be curated from government data. So we're not just looking about whether you conform to masculine norms, but researchers have to be a bit creative to think about, okay, what kind of data can I look at the national level that say this is sort of an index of what's going on at the national level in terms of masculinities. That requires a little bit of careful analytical thinking, but I think it can be done. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, now that we have the technological capability to look at like large language models, pieces
Yeah.
of text, from public speeches or the way things are covered in news media.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think there's lots of opportunity there.
Yeah. Yeah. Agree.
Um, so let me ask you, let's see, I'm looking at my time here. How do you suggest that we better integrate conceptualizations of physical and mental health in relationship to masculinity, especially since we're starting to grasp just how interrelated they are,
Yeah.
mind-body connection. How does masculinity play a role there?
Yeah. I mean, I don't think the audience here needs any convincing that physical health is connected to mental health. I'll just point out two areas, and again, you can see they're hugely relevant to men: suicide as well as loneliness. These are two areas which I think you see a very tight connection between physical and mental health. Right? Suicide. I've always argued that suicide is not just a mental health problem, it's also a physical health. I mean, you are destroying your body. It's also an act of violence, all three. It's not one or the other. Um, and across almost all societies in the world, this is one of the most robust finding that you see across in the US, across all racial groups, across all age groups, and then across almost every country. Not maybe not all, but almost every country in the world, you see consistently men die by suicide at higher rates than women. So I think this would be a great example where we need to question why and how. And I mean, we can go into a lot of details of that, but clearly there's a role for masculinities here, right? The other area that comes to mind is loneliness. And we think of loneliness as a mental health problem in a sense that you perceive that you don't have friends or people around you, and you don't have the level of social connection that you desire. And we also know that loneliness is correlated with mortality and a host of other physical health problems, and that's a problem that men tend to have. Men, again, want to be careful not to overgeneralize, but men compared to women, at least in the U.S., have greater difficulties connecting with people, making friends and retaining friends. And so addressing loneliness, for example, among men, is one way to address both mental health and physical health, right?
Yeah, and so that finding you're talking about with men in the US at least, having more trouble making friends, making meaningful social connections. So can you say a little more about how that ties back to masculinities? I mean, is it not learning? Generally, girls and women are taught from an early age to sort of be the keeper of socialization events,
Yeah.
right? Keeping in touch with friends and family. Is it part of that socialization process that then comes back to have a negative impact on men's health in adulthood?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the message that sort of a masculinity message that you receive is that, men should be independent, should be self-reliant,
Mhm.
and being vulnerable is a bad thing, or you're not somehow not as masculine, then that's a problem, right? But I think it's also complex because there's also, you could argue, a secondary masculine norm out there about brotherhood and
Yeah,
friendship, male friendship, which is and but that seems to be sort of lost in the narrative, and so that needs to be boosted a little bit more of the value of friendships, of connection with people, and that should be something that should be encouraged and normalized and seen as part of um, normal human behavior that applies to both women and men. And so I think, yeah, that's where again, kind of being able to target the masculine norm could be one way to address loneliness.
yeah. Yeah, and that goes back to one of your early points about the need to understand masculinities, right? So maybe friendships, and that brotherhood, those connections are developed in a different way, still be very positive, right, than
Yeah,
what we might traditionally think of in terms of femininities.
yeah,
Um, so I want to ask you another follow-up question about suicide um, and also substance use
sure.
as it relates to like dealing with mental health issues. But I I understand that this concept of deaths of despair, so deaths that occur because of use of substances such as alcohol or other
Yeah,
types of drugs, just
yeah,
sort of weighing the body down to a point where it results in a death. I understand that these are these types of deaths are much higher among men. And in fact, one of my postdocs, who I see is on the call, Mahbouba Shirzad, we worked together on an analysis looking at these deaths due to alcohol and substance use across many countries, and found that, across all sorts of cultures, you do see these higher rates of death among men for that reason. So can you say a little bit about how mental health plays a role here in the intersection of substance use and mental health, and then what that does in terms of mortality?
yeah. I think any particular activity, right? It's always helpful to take a step back and ask ourselves, what are the gender meanings attached to a particular activity? Put it another way, what are the types of masculinity messages attached to a particular activity? Um, so once you put on that gender lens, it's like it's almost like shifting from a world of TV where everything is black and white to all of a sudden there's color everywhere,
Mhm.
right? The same question could be asked about food. Why do men persistently eat more meat than women?
Yeah.
Uh, because there's compelling research, by the way, showing that masculinities are related to meat
Mm.
and that vegetables are seen as feminine. So I think when it comes to substance use, um, my suspicion is that it's again helpful to think about what is it about substance use that is viewed as masculine, and some scholars have speculated, and this I think needs to be studied a little bit more, is that any form of risk-taking behavior is it's just viewed as more masculine. Something has a little bit of danger in it,
Mm.
a bit of risk in it. That can be seen as masculine, and so that's actually, if that hypothesis is correct, then it really changes the way we think about how do we stop that behavior, because trying to argue that this is dangerous, some scholars have said, is that going to be helpful for
Right.
a message for men if they view danger as something that is masculine? And it's like, oh, it's dangerous. Yeah, I want to do it, right?
Mm.
Um, so this is one of some of the dilemmas and paradoxes that we have to grapple with once you put on a gendered lens and look at substance use behavior. It's the same with violence and health behaviors that relate to violence. Um, I mean, if talking about suicide, what is one of the reasons why men die by suicide at higher rates than women? In the US, at least, there is one very compelling reason, and explanation is not even profound, not even complex at all. Just men just use much more lethal forms of suicide. And again, that speaks to this greater desire to take risk and engage in danger.
Hmm. Yeah, I was going to ask you about that because I remember looking years ago at some of the reasons there's gender differences
Yeah,
for suicide rates, and yeah, the mode of it, having a gendered element. And it sounds
yeah.
like that's still the case.
Yeah, men die by firearms, suicide by firearms, much higher rates than women. And in fact, at least here in the US, women have higher rates of suicide ideation and attempts. So that really immediately tells you this is
Yeah.
not simply an issue of mental health. It's about men being willing to take more risk to try, more lethal forms of death or attempts at suicide. That's a big problem.
Fascinating. Um, so we're at the point where we're going to open the floor to any questions from the audience. Um, you feel free to raise your virtual hand or come off mute, put questions in the chat. Um, while we're waiting for questions to come in, Joel, can you say anything? I know you look at suicide and factors related to it for Asian American populations in the US in particular. Can you say anything about the intersections between culture and gender, and how the combination of the two might play different roles in mental health outcomes?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, suicide is such a interesting and complex phenomenon that is interlaced with issues of race and culture and gender, right? So you could think about how different cultures have different beliefs about the nature of death and the acceptability of suicide. And that obviously plays a huge role in rates of suicide. So, just to give a really simple example, countries with some of the lowest rates of suicide tend to be Muslim countries.
Mm.
And that's a very, very strong cultural stigma, in terms of, informed by religion about the unacceptability of suicide that might account for lower rates. Um, so again, kind of the extent to which the culture believes in in the acceptability of suicide is a concern. Um, there is also the extent to which in a particular society or the extent the accessibility to lethal forms of suicide is a concern. So to give a very simple example, again, in the context of the U.S. and the context of immigration, there is no question, it's indisputable. You look at the data, no matter how you analyze it, that the access to firearms is contributing to high rates of suicide in the US. I don't know how no matter how you dissect the data, right? And in the US, which groups have the highest rates of suicide? Well, it tends to be white men, it tend to be a little bit like middle-aged white men, particularly white men living in rural areas. And these tend to be the men who have the higher rates of firearm ownership.
Mhm.
So let me give one simple example of how this applies to other racially minoritized groups. Asian Americans have lower rates of suicide than white Americans. Although if you look at recent trends, that uh, difference is narrowing. Its rates of suicide are going up. And I've been asked in a bunch of interviews, like, what's going on? Like, why, are Asian Americans more stressed? And maybe I think, and again, this is in the realm of speculation, but I think there's a simpler reason for that, a less complex reason. There's just a growing rate of firearm ownership among Asian Americans, particularly Asian American men. That's very troubling. So many Asian American immigrants come from countries that don't have a culture of gun ownership. And so, one of the studies I did, we found lower rates of use of firearms for suicide among Asian Americans. More common is to use as hanging, which again is pretty lethal, but sometimes you can intervene. Right, firearm suicide, you're almost 100% likelihood of being successful, unfortunately. But with growing rates of firearm ownership, that's going to unfortunately lead to higher rates of suicide among Asian Americans.
That's very interesting. And so do you think the increased rates in ownership among Asian Americans, particularly men, is that assimilation into American culture? Is it a fear for their safety, given some of the anti-Asian hate that we've seen over the last several years? What do you think accounts for that ownership?
Yeah. I don't fully know, and I think that's, I hope anybody out there who wants to study this for a dissertation, I think that's a good topic to look at. So anything I say is in a realm of speculation. And so again, this is where, I want to go back to some of the complex intersectional um, areas where you look at the intersection of gender and race for Asian Americans. And what it means to own a firearm. Again, there's some research looking at that studied that found that when you threaten a man's masculinity, I've had colleagues who looked at it, threaten them. The creative ways to threaten a person's masculinity is by sort of hinting to them that they're not as masculine as they think they are. Their interest in firearms grow. So it's almost like owning a firearm is a way of restoring your masculinity.
Mhm.
There's also some hints of research suggesting that you do case studies of men who have gone on mass killings using firearms, at least in the U.S. That you look at some of these case studies of what's going on in their lives. It's not this so-called stereotypically macho man. It's often men who have been bullied or kind of not performed well in some aspects of their life. And so there's this suggestion that the firearm is a way of restoring, boosting your masculinity. Um, if you're sort of physically weak, this is one of the ways you gain power. So how does this relate to Asian Americans? Because Asian American men are sometimes stereotyped or viewed in society, in US society, as not sufficiently masculine. So I wonder if sometimes this is a way of boosting your masculinity to be saying, I'm as masculine as some of the other white men by owning a firearm. And again, if that's the case, then we have to try really hard to change that message.
Yeah. Yeah, and I've been very interested in the gendered aspects of mass shootings in the US. We
Yeah,
often don't, that's not often part of the conversation, right? We
yeah,
talk about gun policy and access to firearms. Some people talk about mental health
right.
or you know mental distress or psychoses as part of why certain people end up committing mass shootings. But I think for me, what is missing is a discussion of what role masculinities
Yes.
play in this.
Yeah.
And when you add to that access to firearms, whether you're talking about violence against others or violence against yourself, it starts to paint a whole different picture. Very fascinating.
Yeah, I'll just quickly mention that there was a study that was just published in our journal, Psychology of Men and Masculinities, that looked at, a variety of mass shootings committed by men, and trying to look at, you have all these case studies. You can look at the lives of these people and what they were doing, and there's one consistent factor that came out across men involved in these shootings, which is really disturbing, which is that. Many of them had this misogynistic view of women, kind
Mhm.
of anti-women, hatred of women, or think that women have neglected them, or stuff like that, that were present in their lives. That's something that's obviously gendered and needs to be addressed.
Yeah. Yeah. Very interesting. Um, I I have another question about where you think research and maybe programmatic intervention type of work in this area is going next. Um, from where you sit as both an editor and an academic and someone who's a leader in these fields, where do you see work on masculinity and particularly mental health going in the future?
Yeah, it's a great question. I've highlighted a few examples. Love to see masculinity studied at a macro level, so that's one thing. Um, I would love to see more intervention research that explicitly incorporates masculinities. So much of the research in the last 20 years have been showing, look at all these problems or outcomes related to masculinities, and this is something we need to pay attention to, which I think is great. But the next frontier of work is, well, how do we now develop intervention? So, very simple experimental design. If you're randomly assigning people to two conditions, one that's sort of a gender neutral, we don't really talk about gender at all in any way, and the other where you explicitly incorporate um, discussions of masculinities in the intervention, you see one outperforms the other. Uh, this, there are a few studies that have talked about that, but that's not very common.
Yeah. I see a question in the chat from Asta. Could you talk a little bit about what you would conceptualize as positive masculinities? So you mentioned brotherhood and, as a form of friendship, but anything else you can say about what constitutes positive masculinities?
Sure. Uh, First of all, I'll say that again, this is a term that is contested even among scholars. Some scholars are uneasy with the term positive masculinities. I'm not going to tell you what to believe. I think you can read the literature and come to your own conclusions. Some scholars are uncomfortable with the term because they feel that if you start labeling terms like, hey, being uh, gender egalitarian as positive masculinities, you're uh, connecting with emotions, and that's positive masculinity. You say, well, aren't they human qualities? These are qualities that all people of all genders should have, and is it better to just call them human qualities that everyone should have rather than masculine qualities? So that's been one of the critiques of positive masculinities have come up. Not everybody agrees with that critique, so I want to put it out there as something for you for us to think about. But one way to think of positive masculinities, if that's an area that is of interest to you, is you could you could ask people, what are you could take the approach that I've suggested, which is you ask people to just say, all right, in the US or in whatever country you belong to, most people believe that men should, and complete the sentence, right?
Mhm.
And then um, and then you ask folks, like, to what extent do you believe? Do you endorse that? And then you correlate that with other outcomes. So when we did that approach, we found that there were a whole bunch of norms that were, some of them were not very positive, but there were one or two that were actually kind of positive. One of which, contrary to stereotype, is that one of the more common norms on that list was most people believe that men should not be violent. So that raises the question: is violence a masculine norm, or is it not a masculine norm? The way I think about it is that there are two competing masculine norms.
Yeah.
One advocating for violence, and one advocating for nonviolence. So if you think of it that way, then there is potentially a positive masculine norm. So one way I like to think about positive masculinity is to focus on norms that are positive,
Mhm.
uh, and highlight that.
Yeah, so like real men have control over their emotions and wouldn't resort to violence, right? Whereas in other contexts, it might be that um, men show their emotions through violence. So depending on which way you buy into those norms. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah,
The other thing I was thinking about in the context of global health work is, and this could apply in the US as well, um, male involvement in things, is particularly around the domestic sphere, or child rearing. What role do men play in that? And I've noticed shifts, especially if you're talking about maternal and child health, like male involvement in that, and how you can utilize norms around protecting the health and well-being of the family to encourage male involvement in things like childbirth, getting women to antenatal care, taking care of small children as a way to protect the family.
yeah, yeah. So that would be an example of a positive masculine norm.
Yeah. So we have a question from Thomas. In Southern Africa, I've
Yeah,
seen a lot of rhetoric around suicide entering into daily conversations, especially among young men who will joke, "Go kill yourself," and fear that this normalizes and condones suicide as a viable option or response to problems. Have you seen it or anything similar to this in the US or elsewhere?
yeah, that's such a interesting question. I think social media is um, one of the ways that normalizes suicide, which is terrible. I've seen some. This is not an area I've studied extensively. I don't. My research doesn't focus explicitly on social media, but I've read reports of social media even in the U.S. Um, Trying to normalize suicide as something that is a very viable option, even forming like groups of people who are actively thinking of killing themselves into a support group. And a support group is in this case not in a good way. It's like supporting each other, egging each other on. So yeah, that could be a concern. Um, and any any effort that we can take to counter this will be helpful. I think if you kind of utilize the power of social norms, right? If there's a movement trying to normalize suicide, there should also be a movement trying to normalize help seeking
Mhm.
for suicide ideation. So, putting out public service announcements that, most X percentage of individuals who seek help for uh, feelings of suicide from a mental health professional often feel better, stuff like that, can be helpful in countering this trend.
Yeah. Yeah, and social media can certainly contribute to some of that groupthink, and
Yeah.
yeah, that's concerning. All right. Well, thank you, Joel. I always enjoy chatting with you. I always learn something, and today's no exception. So thank you for taking the time to join us today.
Oh yeah, you're welcome. It's such a pleasure to talk with you all and to learn with you all, and just recognizing the global reach of what you all are doing is just so interesting to hear from folks from a variety of different countries. So thank you.
Yeah. And so for those of you who are not already subscribed, you can sign up to our newsletter, and also follow us on social media to hear more about upcoming webinars. We are trying to host one in June, but then we will be taking a break for July and August and come back in the fall. But you can learn more about our future sessions through the newsletter and our social channels. So Joel, thank you again, and thanks to everyone for joining. Take care.